Number 1. Martin McNeil, the doctor who deceived an entire community. There are certain individuals who seem, by every outward measure, to represent the very best that a community has to offer. They are the people neighbors wave to from their driveways, the people colleagues trust with their most important decisions, the people whose names carry weight and whose reputations are unimpeachable. Martin Joseph McNeil was, for many years, exactly that kind of man. He was a physician, a licensed attorney, a devoted father of 8 children, a former bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a fixture in the close-knit community of Pleasant Grove, Utah, a city nestled just south of Salt Lake City, in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains. To virtually everyone who knew him, Martin McNeil was a man to be admired, a man who had built his life around service, faith, and family. What no one in Pleasant Grove could have imagined during those years of Sunday sermons, neighborhood dinners, and school carpool lines was that Martin McNeil was carefully concealing a darkness that would eventually cost his wife her life and send shockwaves through every circle that had ever welcomed him. Michaela McNeil was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman. Born Michaela Somers, she had been a beauty queen in her younger years, winning titles that reflected both her natural warmth and her poised, gracious presence. She met Martin in the 1970s, and the two built what appeared from the outside to be an ideal life together. They raised 8 children, several of whom were adopted from other countries, and they were deeply embedded in their faith community. Michaela was known as an anchor, a steady, loving, dedicated mother who poured herself into her family, and who, by the accounts of her daughters who would later testify against her husband, was the heart of the McNeil household. She trusted her husband completely, as a wife trusts a physician who also happens to be a man of God. That trust, prosecutors would later argue, is precisely what Martin McNeil exploited in the most calculated way imaginable. In the years leading up to April 2007, Martin McNeil had been living a secret life. He had begun an affair with a woman named Gypsy Willis, whom he had met online. Willis, investigators would later learn, had been deeply woven into his plans and his private world, even as Michelle remained entirely unaware. Prosecutors at his eventual trial argued that McNeil, whose medical training gave him an intimate understanding of how medications interact with the human body, devised a scheme to remove his wife from the picture so that he could begin a new life with Willis. The mechanism of that scheme, the prosecution contended, was a cosmetic procedure that Michael had long been reluctant to undergo. According to trial testimony, Martin pressured Michelle to have a facelift, insisting on the procedure and even inserting himself into the selection of medications she would be given during her recovery. His daughters later testified that their mother had seemed uncomfortable with how aggressively their father pushed for the surgery and how involved he became in the specifics of her post-operative care. Michelle McNeil underwent her facelift in early April 2007. On April 11, 2007, just days into her recovery, and while still in the early and vulnerable stages of healing, Michaela was found unresponsive in the bathtub of the family's home in Pleasant Grove. Martin McNeil placed a call to emergency services and was later found by neighbors holding his wife in the tub. Emergency responders arrived and efforts were made to revive Michelle, but she was pronounced deceased at the hospital. Investigators at the time noted the circumstances, but the death was initially attributed to natural causes, consistent with a cardiovascular event, and the McNeil family moved forward in the shadow of apparent tragedy. What changed everything was the refusal of Martin McNeil's own daughters to accept that their mother had simply died of a heart condition. Alexis Summers, his oldest biological daughter, and herself a medical professional, became convinced almost immediately that something was profoundly wrong. She and her sisters noticed that their father had moved Gypsy Willis into the family home within weeks of their mother's death, initially presenting her to the children as a nanny named Jillian. When Alexis recognized Willis and confronted her father, Martin McNeil dismissed his daughter's concerns and continued to pursue his relationship with Willis openly. Alexis and her sisters began pressing law enforcement to take a closer look at the circumstances of their mother's death, and they did not stop pressing for years. The investigation that eventually built around Martin McNeil was painstaking and largely circumstantial. There was no single definitive piece of physical evidence that conclusively established how Michele died, and no medical examiner who worked the case was able to say with absolute certainty that her death was a homicide rather than a natural event. What prosecutors were able to assemble was a picture constructed from dozens of smaller pieces, the unusual cocktail of medications found in Michele's system, all of which Martin had specifically requested or arranged, the accounts of fellow inmates at a later jailhouse stay, who testified that McNeil had spoken candidly about how to cause a death that would appear to be the result of natural causes. The speed with which he installed his mistress in the family home, and the testimony of his daughters, who painted a portrait of a father whose behavior in the days after their mother's death was, in their view, inconsistent with grief and deeply consistent with relief. Martin McNeil was arrested in 2012 and stood trial in 2013 in a Provo, Utah courtroom that was packed with observers following a case that had by then drawn national media attention. The trial lasted more than 3 weeks and saw over 70 witnesses take the stand. The prosecution argued that McNeil had exploited his dual expertise as both a physician and an attorney to construct a plan that he believed would go undetected, and that he had counted on his reputation, his standing in the community, and his professional credentials to deflect any suspicion that might arise. The defense countered that Michele had died of pre-existing heart conditions, that the autopsy findings were consistent with natural causes, and that the prosecution was attempting to construct a crime from circumstances that amounted to coincidence and grief, distorted by estranged family members. On November 9, 2013, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Martin McNeil was found guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The announcement prompted gasps and tears in the courtroom, particularly from Michelle's daughters, who had spent years fighting to ensure that their mother's death did not go unanswered. Alexis Summers, who had been one of the most persistent voices demanding justice, later said that she was grateful, but that the verdict could not give her back her mother. McNeil was sentenced in September 2014 to 15 years to life in prison for the murder conviction, with an additional concurrent sentence of 15 years for the obstruction charge. He continued to maintain his innocence, and his lawyers pursued appeals, arguing that the evidence had been insufficient to sustain the conviction. Those appeals were unsuccessful. The Utah Court of Appeals upheld his conviction in March 2017, finding that the evidence presented at trial had been sufficient to support the jury's findings. Martin McNeil never saw freedom again. He was found deceased in his prison cell in April 2017, bringing to a close the legal chapter of a case that had transfixed Utah and the nation for years. The aftermath of the McNeil case reverberated through the community of Pleasant Grove in ways that are difficult to fully measure. A congregation that had revered McNeil as a bishop was forced to reckon with the fact that the man who had stood at their pulpit and offered spiritual guidance had been concealing behavior that stood in direct contradiction to everything he publicly espoused. Colleagues at the Utah State Developmental Center, where he had served as medical director, grappled with the knowledge that a man entrusted with the care of some of the most vulnerable individuals in the state had been capable of such calculated cruelty. Michele's daughters, meanwhile, channeled their grief and their hard-won experience into advocacy, speaking publicly about the case and about the ways in which trusted institutions can sometimes fail to see what is hiding in plain sight. The McNeil case became a textbook illustration of how thoroughly a person can construct a false identity, how effectively charm and credentials can insulate a person from scrutiny, and how often it is the quietest and most persistent voices, in this case the voices of daughters who simply refuse to stop asking questions, that ultimately cut through the performance and expose the truth beneath it. Number 2. Drew Peterson, the officer who lived above the law. In the suburb of Bolingbrook, Illinois, just outside Chicago, Drew Peterson spent decades building a life that seemed, on its surface, to be the very picture of civic dedication. He was a police sergeant, a man who wore a badge, carried a weapon, and was entrusted by his community to enforce the law and protect its residents. He was a familiar face at community events, a man who could turn on charm with the ease of someone who had practiced it for years, and who moved through social circles with the confident ease of someone who believed, at some fundamental level, that the rules governing ordinary people did not apply to him. He married 4 times. He was frequently in relationships with women significantly younger than himself, and 2 of those wives would eventually become central figures in one of the most disturbing law enforcement scandals in Illinois history. Kathleen Savio was Drew Peterson's 3rd wife. The 2 had met and married, and by the early 2000s their relationship had deteriorated into what those close to Kathleen described as a deeply unhappy and at times frightening dynamic. Kathleen had confided in friends and family members that she was afraid of Drew, that he had made statements to her that left her feeling unsafe, and that the power imbalance created by his position as a police officer made it difficult for her to feel that she had anywhere to turn. Her concerns were documented, at least to some degree, in accounts given to people close to her, but in the absence of decisive intervention, the relationship continued its troubled course until the couple divorced. Their divorce proceedings were contentious and bitter, centered in significant part on financial disputes, and Kathleen had reportedly told individuals close to her that she feared what Drew Peterson might do to her. On March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found deceased in the bathtub of her home in Bolingbrook. She was 40 years old. The original investigation into her death concluded that she had slipped, fallen, and drowned accidentally. An inquest jury reached the same conclusion. Kathleen Savio was buried, her death officially classified as an accident, and Drew Peterson continued his life as a Bolingbrook police sergeant. He remarried a 4th time, to a woman named Stacy Peterson, who was significantly younger than him and who, by several accounts, had also begun to experience the kind of fear that Kathleen had expressed to those around her. In October 2007, Stacy Peterson disappeared. She was 23 years old. Drew Peterson told investigators that she had left him for another man and that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts. The disappearance of his 4th wife, however, prompted authorities to revisit the death of his 3rd. Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed in November 2007, and a second examination of her remains produced findings that stood in stark contrast to the original conclusion. The new examination determined that Kathleen's death had not been accidental. She had been the victim of a homicide. The manner in which investigators had initially concluded she had drowned accidentally, findings that had allowed Drew Peterson to continue his life unimpeded for 3 years, became a significant point of scrutiny in the public reckoning that followed. Drew Peterson was arrested in May 2009 and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. The case that prosecutors assembled against him was built substantially on testimony from people to whom both Kathleen and Stacy had confided their fears, including statements that Kathleen had reportedly made, in which she expressed her belief that Drew Peterson was capable of causing her harm and making it look like an accident. Illinois passed new legislation, referred to informally as Drew's Law, that allowed certain categories of hearsay testimony to be admitted in cases where a witness was unavailable due to the alleged actions of the defendant. The law was specifically tailored to the circumstances of the Peterson case, and allowed jurors to hear accounts of what both women had reportedly said about their fears. Drew Peterson's defense attorneys challenged the constitutionality of the evidentiary approach and argued vigorously that the entire case against their client was built on second-hand accounts rather than hard evidence. The trial, which took place in 2012 in Will County, became a media spectacle that reflected the broader public fascination with a case involving a police officer accused of the very crimes he had spent his career ostensibly fighting against. Drew Peterson himself was not a quiet or retiring figure during the proceedings. He had given numerous media interviews in the years before his arrest, making comments that struck many observers as flippant and ill-suited to a man who had lost 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. His courtroom demeanor was similarly noted by observers and commentators who watched the proceedings closely. On September 6, 2012, after approximately 14 hours of deliberation spread across 2 days, the jury found Drew Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. The verdict produced emotional reactions from Kathleen's family members, who had waited nearly a decade for a legal reckoning that reflected what they had long believed to be true. Drew Peterson was sentenced in November 2012 to 38 years in prison. His attorneys announced plans to appeal, and Peterson himself continued to maintain his innocence. He would later face additional criminal exposure when he was charged in a separate matter with soliciting the killing of the prosecutor who had led the case against him, Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow. That charge added yet another layer to a case that had already been extraordinary in its complexity and its reach. Stacey Peterson has never been found. The question of what happened to her remains officially unresolved, though Peterson has long been considered a suspect in her disappearance by investigators who have never ceased to regard her case as a probable homicide. The Drew Peterson case stands as one of the most consequential law enforcement corruption stories of the modern era, a case that fundamentally altered Illinois evidentiary law and that raised profound questions about how effectively communities can protect themselves when the threat comes wearing a badge. Number 3. Neil Entwistle, the husband who vanished across the ocean. When Neil Entwistle moved from England to the United States with his American wife Rachel and their infant daughter Lillian, the life they appeared to be building together looked, at least from the outside, like the kind of story that inspires optimism. Neil was a graduate of the University of York with a master's degree in electronic engineering. Rachel, born Rachel Souza and raised in Massachusetts, had been educated at the College of the Holy Cross and had pursued a teaching certificate in England, where she had met Neil in 1999 during a study abroad year. The two had fallen in love, married in 2003, and welcomed their daughter Lillian Rose into the world in April 2005. By January 2006, they had settled into a rented home in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, a quiet and well-regarded suburb west of Boston, and Rachel was reconnecting with her American roots while Neil searched for employment in the technology sector. To everyone who knew them, they were a young, educated, loving couple embarking on a promising chapter of their lives. What Rachel did not know, and what those around them had no reason to suspect, was that the life Neil Entwistle was projecting bore little resemblance to the reality he was living. Neil had been unable to secure meaningful employment since the family's arrival in the United States, and the financial pressures on the household were escalating. He had been involved in various internet-based business schemes that had not produced the income he had represented to Rachel and to their social circle. Among the most disturbing details to emerge during the subsequent investigation was evidence suggesting that Neil had been exploring deeply troubling content online in the period leading up to the events of January 2006, searches that prosecutors would later argue reflected a state of mind in which he was contemplating the elimination of the very family he was publicly presenting as his reason for living in the United States. The picture of the devoted husband and new father, eager to establish himself in his wife's home country, was, according to prosecutors, a fabrication erected over a reality of desperation, deception, and ultimately a decision to end the lives of two people who depended on him completely. On January 20th, 2006, Rachel Entwistle, 27 years old, and Lillian Rose Entwistle, 9 months old, were in the family's Hopkinton home when they were fatally injured. Rachel was in the master bedroom. Little Lillian was with her mother. The weapon used was a .22 caliber handgun that belonged to Rachel's father and that had been stored at her parents' home approximately 50 miles away. Neil Entwistle subsequently returned the weapon to his father-in-law's residence before taking his next and most revealing action. He purchased a one-way airline ticket to England and flew out of Boston on January 21, 2006, leaving behind the bodies of his wife and daughter in their Hopkinton home without alerting any emergency services, without contacting any family member, and without offering any explanation to anyone who might wonder where his wife and child had gone. Rachel's family grew alarmed when they were unable to reach her. A welfare check was conducted by local police, and on January 22, 2006, officers conducting a second search of the home discovered the bodies of Rachel and Lillian in the master bedroom. The discovery was devastating to everyone who had known and loved them. The community of Hopkinton, Rachel's family, and her wide circle of friends were consumed simultaneously by grief and by the question of where Neil Entwistle had gone. He was located in England, staying at his parents' home, and he gave a statement to local police there before eventually returning to the United States to face the investigation that had by then fully focused on him as the central suspect. Neil Entwistle was arrested on February 8, 2006, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His defense, built by attorney Elliot Weinstein, rested on the extraordinary claim that Rachel had obtained the firearm from her father's home, had caused Lillian's injury, and then injured herself, and that Neil had discovered the scene upon returning home and, in a state of shock and overwhelmed by grief, had returned the weapon to his father-in-law's house before fleeing to England to be near his own parents. The defense argued that Neil's actions after the discovery, as shocking and inexplicable as they appeared, were the actions of a man consumed by grief rather than guilt. Weinstein notably did not call a single witness during the trial, relying instead on cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses to raise doubt. The jury was unconvinced. After deliberating for 2 days, they returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder on June 25, 2008. Neil Entwistle was sentenced the following day to 2 concurrent terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. His parents, who had attended the trial and remained staunchly in their son's corner, spoke outside the courthouse after the verdict and insisted that their son was innocent, maintaining that the evidence pointed to Rachel having caused the tragedy herself. The Middlesex District Attorney's Office expressed a different view, with District Attorney Jerry Leone saying that Entwistle had been held accountable for what he called reprehensible and cowardly acts. Neil Entwistle subsequently pursued appeals, including a petition to the United States Supreme Court, all of which were denied. He remains incarcerated at Old Colony Correctional Center in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, serving out his life sentence while continuing to insist that he did not cause the deaths of his wife and daughter. The case of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle remains one of the most heartbreaking stories of betrayal in Massachusetts true crime history, a story about a young family who had every reason to look forward to their future, and a husband who, by the jury's unanimous finding, took that future away from them. Number 4. Aaron Hernandez, the superstar who carried a secret. In the spring of 2012, Aaron Hernandez signed a contract extension with the New England Patriots, worth approximately $40 million. He was 22 years old. He was widely considered one of the most talented tight ends in the National Football League, a player whose combination of size, speed, and football intelligence had made him not just a key component of one of the most successful franchises in professional sports history, but also a legitimate star in his own right, a young man whose best years appeared to be entirely ahead of him. He had grown up in Bristol, Connecticut, and had played college football at the University of Florida before being selected in the 4th round of the 2010 NFL Draft by the Patriots. In the years between his arrival in New England and the signing of that extension, he had developed into a critical part of a Patriots offense that was among the best in professional football. He had endorsement relationships, a fiancée named Shayana Jenkins, and a daughter. He was, by every public measure, living the kind of life that people spend years dreaming about. What Aaron Hernandez was also doing during those years, and what he had apparently been doing for considerably longer than anyone in the Patriots organization or the broader public knew, was conducting a separate life whose details were so different from the one on display at Gillette Stadium that they seem, in retrospect, almost impossible to reconcile with the public persona. Odin Lloyd was 27 years old in the summer of 2013. He played semi-professional football for the Boston Bandits of the New England Football League, and he had developed a friendship with Aaron Hernandez through a natural connection. Lloyd's girlfriend, Shania Jenkins, was the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, Shayanna. The two men had spent time together socially, moving in overlapping circles in the Boston area. By most accounts, Odin Lloyd was well liked by those around him, a young man with athletic ambitions and a warm presence who had connected with one of the most famous athletes in the region in a way that seemed, to everyone who observed it, like a straightforward and uncomplicated friendship. There was no reason visible to anyone on the outside of their dynamic to anticipate what would happen in the early hours of June 17, 2013. On that night, Aaron Hernandez traveled with two associates, Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, to the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston and picked up Odin Lloyd. Surveillance footage from a camera near Lloyd's home captured the group departing. At approximately 3:23 in the morning, Lloyd's body was found in an industrial park in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, less than a mile from Aaron Hernandez's home. He had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. In Lloyd's pocket, investigators found a key to a rental car that had been obtained by Aaron Hernandez. Within hours of the discovery of Lloyd's body, law enforcement had zeroed in on Hernandez as the central figure in what they were treating as a homicide. Home surveillance footage from Hernandez's own property, captured by a system he had installed himself, showed him handling what appeared to be a firearm on the night of the incident. A cleaning service had been called to his home in the immediate aftermath. The rental car associated with the key found on Lloyd's body was located and processed for evidence. Within 9 days of Odin Lloyd's death, Aaron Hernandez was placed under arrest. Within hours of his arrest, the New England Patriots terminated his contract. The investigation and subsequent trial produced a portrait of a man whose public image had been constructed as carefully as any fictional character, concealing a private world that was defined by paranoia, intimidation, and a willingness to cause harm to people perceived as threats or inconveniences. The precise reason why Aaron Hernandez decided that Odin Lloyd needed to be eliminated was never definitively established at trial, and remains, at least in part, a matter of inference and speculation. Prosecutors pointed to evidence suggesting that Lloyd may have had knowledge of other incidents involving Hernandez, and that Hernandez, whose sense of loyalty and threat was shaped by dynamics in his own background, had concluded that Lloyd represented a liability. Whatever the specific motivation, the jury was presented with an overwhelming body of circumstantial evidence, placing Hernandez at the scene, in possession of a firearm, and in the company of two men who subsequently cooperated with, or were charged in connection with the investigation. The trial began in January 2015. On April 15, 2015, after 36 hours of deliberation spread across 7 days, the jury found Aaron Hernandez guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Odin Lloyd. He was also convicted on related weapons charges. The automatic sentence under Massachusetts law for first-degree murder was life in prison without the possibility of parole, and that sentence was immediately imposed. Aaron Hernandez was 25 years old. The reaction in the courtroom was visceral. His mother and fiancé wept. Members of Lloyd's family delivered victim impact statements that spoke to the magnitude of what had been taken from them by the actions of a man who had everything and chose to destroy it, along with someone else's life. Hernandez was also subsequently tried for a separate double shooting in Boston in 2012 and was acquitted of those charges in 2017. On April 19, 2017, Aaron Hernandez was found deceased in his prison cell at the Souza Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts, in what authorities determined was a self-inflicted death. He was 27 years old. The story of Aaron Hernandez is, among other things, a study in the gap between public image and private reality, and in how effectively the architecture of celebrity can prevent those closest to a person from perceiving what lies beneath the performance. Number 5. Jason Young, the businessman with the perfect alibi. When Michelle Fisher Young was found by her sister Meredith on the morning of November 3, 2006, in the master bedroom of her home, in a Wake County subdivision near Raleigh, North Carolina, the community that surrounded the Young family was shocked in the way that communities always are when something incomprehensible shatters the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Michelle was 29 years old and 5 months pregnant with the couple's second child. Their 2-year-old daughter Cassidy was found in the house, physically unharmed, hiding beneath the covers of a bed. Jason Young, Michelle's husband of several years, was not home. He was, by his own account, 160 miles away at a hotel in Hillsville, Virginia, where he had traveled for a business trip. He had an alibi. He was not there. And for years, that alibi, combined with the absence of any physical evidence directly linking him to the scene, meant that Jason Young went about his life, while the investigation into his wife's death ground forward, without resolution. Jason Young was, to those who knew him socially and professionally, a personable and engaging man. He worked in sales, was comfortable in social settings, and presented himself with the kind of easy confidence that tends to make people feel at ease in his company. His and Michelle's marriage had, by the accounts that emerged during his eventual prosecution, been defined by tensions rooted in infidelity and financial pressures, but those tensions were not visible to most of the people in their lives. Michelle's family had their concerns, and her friends had absorbed some of the confidences she had shared with them about the state of her marriage, but from the outside, the Youngs appeared to be a family moving through the ordinary challenges of young adult life, not a household in which one partner was in any danger from the other. Prosecutors who eventually built the case against Jason Young argued that he had used a business trip as the framework for an extraordinarily calculated plan. According to the theory of the prosecution, Jason Young left his hotel in Hillsville not long after checking in on the night of November 2, 2006. Disabled or evaded security cameras in a side entrance stairwell of the hotel, drove approximately 160 miles back to Raleigh, caused Michelle's death at their home, and then drove back to Virginia in time to be present on the morning of November 3rd, returning calls and conducting himself as a man who had spent an ordinary night away on business. The prosecution's case centered significantly on inconsistencies in Jason Young's accounts of his whereabouts, on the patterns captured or not captured by hotel surveillance systems, and on the broader context of a marriage that had become, by multiple accounts, deeply troubled in its final months. Jason Young was indicted in December 2009, more than 3 years after Michelle's death. His first trial, held in June 2011, ended in a mistrial when the jury deadlocked at 8 votes for acquittal and 4 for conviction, a result that seemed to many observers to suggest that the prosecution's circumstantial case had not been sufficient to persuade the full jury panel. Young himself had taken the witness stand during that first trial and acknowledged that he had not been a perfect husband, but denied having anything to do with his wife's death. A retrial was ordered and began in January 2012. The retrial produced a different result. Prosecutors introduced evidence that had not been presented in the first proceeding and built a more comprehensive picture of the timeline and of Jason Young's state of mind and behavior in the period leading up to and following Michelle's death. On March 5, 2012, after just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury in the retrial returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. The speed of that verdict, coming from a jury that had heard weeks of testimony across multiple weeks of proceedings, was striking. Judge Donald Stevens, who had presided over the case, noted from the bench that Michelle Young had not merely lost her life, but had suffered an attack of a severity rarely seen in his judicial experience. Jason Young was sentenced immediately to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as required by North Carolina law for a first-degree murder conviction. He was 37 years old. The case was subsequently appealed, and in 2014 the North Carolina Court of Appeals vacated the guilty verdict on the grounds that evidence from a separate civil proceeding, a wrongful death lawsuit, in which a default judgment had been entered against Young for failing to respond to the suit, had been improperly admitted at the retrial and had unfairly prejudiced the jury. That ruling generated considerable distress among Michelle's family and the broader community that had followed the case, and the prospect of a third trial loomed. However, the North Carolina Supreme Court ultimately reversed the Court of Appeals' decision in 2015, ruling that the conviction had not been tainted and reinstating the guilty verdict. Jason Young's life sentence was confirmed, and he remains incarcerated in the North Carolina prison system. Michelle Young's daughter Cassidy, who was present in the house on the night her mother's life was taken, was raised by her maternal grandparents and her aunt. The family has spoken publicly over the years about the way the case reshaped their lives and about their commitment to ensuring that Michelle's memory is preserved with dignity and love. Number 6. Paul Flores, the classmate who walked her home. On the evening of May 25, 1996, 19-year-old Kristen Smart attended an off-campus party near the California Polytechnic State University campus in San Luis Obispo, California. She was a freshman, newly arrived at the school, and still in the earliest stages of building the college life she had looked forward to. The party was the kind of informal social gathering that defines the landscape of freshman year, a chance to meet people and begin the slow process of finding a community in a new place. Kristen was by all accounts a vibrant and outgoing young woman, someone whose personality drew people toward her and whose presence lit up the spaces she occupied. When the party wound down and it was time to head back to campus, Kristen left with a small group of students who were heading in the same general direction. As the group dispersed along the route, the number of people walking with Kristen dwindled. The last person to remain with her was a fellow freshman named Paul Flores. Paul Flores had made himself noticeable to Kristen and others in the days and weeks before that night. Several witnesses who testified years later at his trial recalled observing him in contexts that suggested an uncomfortable fixation on Kristen, appearing in places where she was without having a clear reason to be there, and inserting himself into her vicinity with a frequency that had struck at least some observers as unusual. On the night of May 25, when the other students who had been walking with Kristen went their separate ways, Flores insisted on continuing to accompany her, telling the others that he would make sure she got home safely. The others accepted his assurance. They had no reason not to. Paul Flores was a classmate, a young man they had just been socializing with, and nothing about the interaction up to that point had given them cause to feel that Kristen was in any danger. The witnesses who later came forward to describe what they had seen that night would carry the weight of that moment for years, knowing that the last decision the group made before separating was one that would define the rest of Kristen Smart's story. Kristen Smart was never seen again. She was reported missing on May 27, 1996, 2 days after her disappearance, when it became clear that she had not returned to her dormitory and that none of her contacts had heard from her. The initial investigation focused quickly on Paul Flores, who became the primary and essentially sole suspect almost from the beginning. His account of what had happened after the others left him walking with Kristen was inconsistent and troubling to investigators. A search of his dormitory room in the days following her disappearance revealed items that raised questions but did not, at the time, produce the evidence needed to support charges. Kristen was declared legally missing and then, in 2002, declared legally dead. Paul Flores was never arrested. He moved through the years following Kristen's disappearance as a free man, relocating to the Los Angeles area and living a life that, by all external appearances, bore no connection to the case that had consumed San Luis Obispo County for decades. What kept the case alive, in significant part, was the determination of Kristen's family and the eventual involvement of a true crime podcaster named Chris Lambert, whose series Your Own Backyard revisited the investigation in meticulous detail beginning in 2018 and brought renewed national attention to a disappearance that had been fading from public consciousness. The podcast generated new tips, renewed scrutiny of Paul Flores, and contributed to a reinvigoration of the official investigation that ultimately produced tangible results. In 2021, investigators using ground-penetrating radar examined the property of Paul Flores's father, Ruben Flores, in Arroyo Grande, California. They found evidence of a soil disturbance beneath the deck of the home. While Kristen Smart's remains were never conclusively recovered and her body has never been located, the investigation produced sufficient evidence to support the arrest of both Paul Flores and his father Ruben, who was charged as an accessory to the crime. The trial of Paul Flores was held in Monterey County, moved there from San Luis Obispo County due to concerns about pre-trial publicity. It began in 2022 and lasted for approximately 3 months, during which the prosecution laid out a case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony spanning 26 years, and a detailed reconstruction of the night Kristen Smart disappeared. On October 18, 2022, a Monterey County jury returned a unanimous verdict finding Paul Flores guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kristen Smart. Ruben Flores was acquitted by a separate jury of the accessory charge on the same day. On March 10, 2023, Paul Flores appeared before Monterey County Superior Court Judge Jennifer O'Keefe for sentencing. The judge described Flores as a danger to society and denied a defense motion for a new trial. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Kristen Smart's family, who had waited 26 years for a legal finding that reflected what they had always believed, spoke at the sentencing about the impact of the loss on their lives. Kristen's brother Matthew described the decades of uncertainty and grief that had defined their family's experience and spoke directly to the court about the person his sister had been and the future she never had the chance to live. The case of Kristen Smart stands as one of the most enduring reminders that justice, however long delayed, can sometimes still arrive. Number 7. Derek Medina, the husband who told the world himself. In the summer of 2013, a story emerged from a neighborhood in South Miami, Florida, that was unlike virtually any other in the history of American criminal cases. Not because the underlying circumstances were more complicated than other cases, nor because the legal proceedings that followed were more dramatic, but because of the extraordinary and disturbing way in which the perpetrator chose to announce what he had done. Derek Medina was 33 years old. His wife, Jennifer Alfonso, was 27. The two had a relationship that those close to them described as volatile and marked by conflict, and by the summer of 2013, the marriage had reached a point of severe deterioration. Jennifer had reportedly told friends that she was planning to leave Derek, a decision that prosecutors would later argue was at the core of what happened on the morning of August 1, 2013. According to the reconstruction presented at trial, an argument broke out between Derek and Jennifer in their home in South Miami. The confrontation escalated through the couple's upstairs bedroom and then to the kitchen on the ground floor of the house. Jennifer's 10-year-old daughter was in the home at the time, in an upstairs bedroom, and did not directly witness the events that unfolded in the kitchen below. A medical examiner who testified at trial described the physical evidence in a manner that directly contradicted the account Derek Medina would later offer to police, stating that the positioning of Jennifer's body and the angle of the injuries she sustained were inconsistent with a defensive scenario. Jennifer Alfonso was found in the kitchen of the couple's home, deceased, having been struck by 8 gunshots. What Derek Medina did after Jennifer Alfonso's death is the element of this case that makes it unlike almost any other. He used his cell phone to photograph his wife's body. He then logged onto his Facebook account and posted the photograph publicly, along with a written statement in which he acknowledged what had occurred, expressed his belief that he would be going to prison, and offered his version of events in which he characterized what he had done as an act of self-defense necessitated by years of abuse and by Jennifer's behavior during the confrontation. The post was live on his Facebook page for several hours before the platform removed it, but in that time it had been seen by a significant number of people and had prompted calls to law enforcement. Derek Medina subsequently turned himself in to Miami-Dade police. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The investigation produced a body of evidence that prosecutors argued was fundamentally incompatible with the self-defense claim that Medina had telegraphed in his Facebook post and that his legal team pursued at trial. Investigators pointed to evidence suggesting that Medina had made statements to others prior to the incident, indicating a willingness to cause Jennifer harm if she attempted to leave him. At 6 feet tall and approximately 200 pounds, Medina was substantially larger than Jennifer, a factor prosecutors raised in the context of assessing the plausibility of his claim that he had been in fear for his physical safety. The medical examiner's testimony about the positioning of the injuries and what it indicated about Jennifer's posture at the time directly undercut the narrative of a mutual physical confrontation in which Medina had been compelled to act in his own defense. The trial lasted approximately 3 weeks. Medina did not testify on his own behalf. On November 25, 2015, the jury returned a verdict finding Derek Medina guilty of second-degree murder, rejecting the first-degree murder charge that required proof of premeditation, but finding that he had nonetheless caused Jennifer's death with a degree of culpability that far exceeded the self-defense claim. He was also convicted of child neglect, as Jennifer's young daughter had been left alone in the house in the aftermath. In February 2016, Miami-Dade Circuit Judge Yvonne Kolodny sentenced Derek Medina to life in prison, imposing the maximum sentence available under the second-degree murder conviction. The judge's comments at sentencing were pointed. She noted that Medina had effectively announced his own future in his Facebook post, a statement that proved to be among the most accurate self-assessments in modern criminal history. The case of Derek Medina and Jennifer Alfonso became the subject of widespread discussion about the intersection of social media and criminal behavior, about the ways in which the digital public square had created new avenues for self-incrimination, and about the profound and irreversible consequences of domestic conflict that escalates beyond the point of return. Number 8. Brad Cooper, the engineer with secrets in the hard drive. In the quiet suburban community of Cary, North Carolina, a picturesque town outside Raleigh, known for its well-maintained neighborhoods and its reputation as one of the most livable places in the American South, Brad and Nancy Cooper had built the kind of life that looked, by every surface indicator, like a success story. Brad, originally from Medicine Hat, Alberta in Canada, worked as an engineer for Cisco Systems, a prestigious technology firm with significant operations in the Research Triangle region of North Carolina. Nancy, who had grown up in Edmonton, Alberta, was warm, outgoing, and well-liked by the network of friends and neighbors the couple had developed in Cary over the approximately 8 years they had lived there together. They had 2 young daughters, Bella and Katie. They were embedded in a social circle, attended neighborhood events, and were known as a couple who could be counted on to show up. On the surface, there was very little to suggest that anything in the Cooper household was fundamentally wrong. What those around them were not fully aware of was the degree to which the marriage had, by 2008, become deeply troubled. The couple had experienced significant financial strain related to spending patterns that had generated conflict between them. Nancy had been involved in at least one extramarital relationship, and Brad had also allegedly been involved with other individuals during the course of the marriage. By the summer of 2008, Nancy Cooper had reportedly made the decision that she wanted to end the marriage and return to Canada with her daughters, a prospect that those close to her said had become an urgent priority for her. She had spoken to friends and family about her plans to leave Brad, and had reached a point where the marriage was, by her own assessment, irretrievably over. She had also discussed with people close to her the fact that Brad had at one point taken her passport, a detail that would later assume significance in the narrative of control and restriction that prosecutors built around the case. On the morning of July 12, 2008, Nancy Cooper went out for a jog. That, at least, was the account Brad Cooper gave to police when they made contact with him. According to Brad, Nancy had left the house early that morning to run through the neighborhood, as she sometimes did, and had not returned. He said he had taken care of their daughters through the morning, and that when Nancy did not come home, he had begun to make inquiries. Her body was found 2 days later, on July 14, 2008, in a drainage ditch at the end of a cul-de-sac in an unfinished subdivision approximately 3 miles from the Cooper family home. A medical examiner determined that Nancy had been strangled. The investigation that followed centered immediately and substantially on Brad Cooper. Among the most technically significant pieces of evidence in the case was testimony from forensic computer analysts who told the jury that someone had conducted an internet search of the area where Nancy's body was eventually found, from a computer associated with Brad Cooper's workplace in the period immediately before she disappeared. The implication drawn by prosecutors was that Brad had researched the disposal location before carrying out his plan, and that the digital trail embedded in his computer's search history documented the premeditation at the heart of the prosecution's theory of the case. Brad Cooper's defense team challenged the computer evidence vigorously, arguing that the digital evidence had been mishandled and mischaracterized by investigators, and this challenge ultimately provided the basis for the appellate ruling that would unwind his initial conviction. Brad Cooper stood trial for the first time in 2011. After a lengthy proceeding spanning approximately 36 days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on first-degree murder, and Brad was sentenced to life in prison. That conviction was set aside on appeal in 2013 when the North Carolina Court of Appeals found that the trial judge had improperly excluded certain defense testimony related to the computer evidence, finding that the exclusion had prejudiced Cooper's ability to present his defense. The North Carolina Supreme Court declined to take up the state's appeal of that ruling, clearing the way for a retrial. Rather than proceed to a second trial, Brad Cooper accepted a plea agreement with prosecutors in September 2014. He appeared before Superior Court Judge Paul Gessner, who asked him directly whether he had killed Nancy Cooper and disposed of her body. Brad Cooper said that he had. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 12 to 15 years, with credit for the time he had already served since his 2008 arrest. The plea agreement included a provision under which Cooper agreed to relinquish all custody claims over his daughters, who had been in the care of Nancy's twin sister in Canada since their mother's death. The judge described the custody for sentence component of the agreement as repulsive but enforceable. Brad Cooper was released from North Carolina's Mountain View Correctional Institution in November 2020, having served his sentence, and was subsequently deported to Canada. Nancy Cooper's family expressed in public statements that while the plea and the eventual sentence had given them a measure of certainty they had long sought, the outcome did not diminish the loss that has defined their lives since July 2008. Number 9. George Hughley, the lacrosse star no one questioned. At the University of Virginia, which sits in the gracious college town of Charlottesville, in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the men's lacrosse program had long been one of the most celebrated athletic programs on campus. The sport occupies a particular cultural space in the Mid-Atlantic university world, one where athletic excellence and social prominence intersect, and players on elite programs like UVA's tend to move through campus life with a visibility and a social currency that can, for some, create a sense of insulation from ordinary accountability. George Hughley V was a member of that team. He was a large, physically imposing player from an affluent background in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and he had the kind of social presence that came naturally to someone who had grown up with significant privileges and who had spent his formative years as an athlete accustomed to a certain kind of deference. He was charming in the way that certain young men with those specific credentials tend to be charming, and within the social world of UVA lacrosse he was a known and prominent figure. Yeardley Love was everything that the word exceptional is meant to convey. She played women's lacrosse at UVA and was known by teammates, coaches, friends, and family as a person of remarkable depth, warmth, and character. She came from Cockeysville, Maryland, and she had poured herself into the sport and into her studies with the kind of dedication that her family and those who loved her recognized as central to who she was. She and George Hughley had been involved in an on-again, off-again relationship for approximately 2 years, a dynamic that had, in the months leading up to May 2010, become characterized by a volatility that those who knew them had observed with increasing unease. There had been incidents. There had been a confrontation at an earlier point in their relationship, during which Hughley had allegedly physically restrained Yeardley, an incident that had been witnessed by others and that had reportedly been addressed within the athletic program, but had not resulted in formal consequences that might have altered the trajectory of what followed. There had been threatening communications. Yeardley had reportedly told people close to her that the relationship had become something she wanted to leave behind, and by the spring of 2010, she had made clear to those in her circle that she considered the relationship with Hughley to be over. In the early morning hours of May 3, 2010, just days before Yeardley Love was due to graduate from UVA, her roommate returned to their apartment and found Yeardley unresponsive in her bedroom. She called for help. Emergency responders arrived, but Yeardley was beyond the reach of their efforts. She was 22 years old. The investigation that began in the immediate aftermath of her death focused quickly on George Hughley, who had been seen in the vicinity of the apartment building and whose connection to Yeardley was well known on campus. Investigators who examined the scene of her death found physical evidence consistent with a confrontation, including marks on the bedroom door, suggesting it had been forcibly entered. Hughley, when interviewed by police on May 3rd, made statements that placed him at the apartment and acknowledged a physical confrontation with Yeardley, though he characterized what had occurred as something other than what the physical evidence suggested. He was arrested that same day. George Hughley was charged with first-degree murder and several related charges. His trial took place in Charlottesville in February 2012. The prosecution built its case around the physical evidence from the scene, Hughley's own statements to police, a troubling email Hughley had sent to Yeardley in which he had written words that would become among the most cited in the trial proceedings. Words indicating the degree to which his feelings toward her had crossed from affection into something far more threatening, and testimony from witnesses who had observed the deterioration of the relationship and the warning signs that had preceded the events of May 2. Hughley's defense team acknowledged that he had entered Yeardley's apartment and that there had been a physical confrontation, but argued that he had not intended to cause her death and that his level of intoxication at the time should be considered in assessing his mental state. They asked the jury to consider lesser charges, including voluntary manslaughter, rather than the first-degree murder count that carried the heaviest consequences. After approximately 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on February 22, 2012. George Hughley was found guilty of second-degree murder and grand larceny, the latter charge related to the taking of a laptop from Yeardley's apartment. He was acquitted of the remaining charges, including first-degree murder and burglary. The jury recommended a sentence of 25 years on the murder conviction. Judge Edward Hogshire sentenced Hughley to 23 years in prison in August 2012, slightly below the jury's recommendation. Virginia does not have parole, meaning Hughley is required to serve at least 85% of that term. A civil wrongful death lawsuit filed by Yeardley's family was resolved in 2022, with a jury awarding $15 million in damages. George Hughley remains incarcerated. Yeardley Love's family has spoken over the years about carrying her memory forward. about the responsibility they feel to honor who she was, and to speak to the warning signs that preceded her death, in the hope that others might recognize them before it is too late. The broader conversation her case prompted about athlete accountability, about the handling of interpersonal conflict within elite sports programs, and about the way institutions respond to warning signs within their ranks, continues to echo in discussions about campus safety and domestic prevention across the country. Number 10. Grant Hayes, the musician who asked her to come to him. Grant Ruffin Hayes presented himself to the world as a free-spirited, creative young man. He had a burgeoning music career, performing in bars and clubs on the Caribbean island of St. John, and there was an ease and sociability to his public persona that tended to disarm people and make them feel comfortable in his company. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and find his footing quickly, who knew how to read social situations and calibrate his behavior accordingly, and who had, over the years, developed a circle of relationships that gave no outward indication of the darkness that investigators would eventually document in the summer of 2011. Grant Hayes was the father of 2 young boys, whose mother was a woman named Laura Jean Ackerson, a 27-year-old from Kinston, North Carolina, who had been involved with him previously, and who, by 2011, was locked in a contentious custody dispute with him and his wife, Amanda Perry Hayes, over those children. Laura Jean Ackerson was, by the accounts of everyone who knew and loved her, a deeply caring mother. She had been through her own struggles and was working to stabilize her life while fighting for meaningful time with the sons she had with Grant Hayes. The custody situation had become a source of significant conflict between Laura and both Grant and Amanda, and those close to Laura later recounted that she had expressed concerns about the dynamics of her interactions with Grant as the dispute intensified. On July 13, 2011, Laura Jean Ackerson traveled to Raleigh, North Carolina, to the apartment that Grant and Amanda Hayes shared, for a purpose related to the ongoing custody arrangements. She was last seen alive that day. Her family reported her missing several days later when they were unable to reach her and she failed to return home. The investigation that followed produced one of the most disturbing chains of evidence in North Carolina criminal history. Investigators traced the movements of Grant and Amanda Hayes in the days following Laura's disappearance to the home of Amanda's sister in Richmond, Texas, a location approximately 1,000 miles from Raleigh. Evidence gathered at that Texas property and in the surrounding area, including a waterway called Oyster Creek, formed the foundation of what prosecutors would present at trial as a detailed account of what had happened to Laura Ackerson's remains after her death. Prosecutors argued that Laura had been killed at the Hayes apartment in Raleigh on July 13, 2011, and that Grant and Amanda had then made a series of calculated decisions to eliminate any trace of what had occurred. Security footage captured Grant Hayes at a Raleigh Walmart purchasing a saw. Further footage from a Texas home improvement store showed him buying acid. The prosecution's theory, supported by forensic evidence gathered at the Texas property, was that the couple had transported Laura's remains across multiple states in coolers and had then attempted, using the acid and the waters of Oyster Creek, to ensure that no identifiable physical evidence survived. Parts of Laura's remains were ultimately recovered from the creek. Grant Hayes was tried for first-degree murder in August and September 2013. The testimony across the nearly 3 weeks of proceedings painted a picture of a man who had perceived Laura Ackerson as an obstacle, who had decided that the most efficient resolution to the custody dispute was her elimination, and who had then attempted to erase all evidence of what he had done. A former fellow inmate testified that Hayes had spoken to him at the Wake County Detention Center about the events of July 13, 2011, and that account provided some of the most direct testimony the prosecution offered about Hayes's own understanding of what had occurred. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, a remarkably brief period of deliberation for a capital murder trial, before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Judge Donald Stevens, who had also presided over the Jason Young retrial, noted from the bench before imposing sentence that the speed of the jury's deliberations reflected the strength of the evidence assembled against Hayes. Grant Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at the Caledonia Correctional Institution in Halifax County, North Carolina. Amanda Perry Hayes was tried separately. Her defense team argued that she had not participated in Laura's death and had assisted only in the aftermath out of fear of her husband. The jury did not accept the full weight of that argument, but found her guilty on the lesser charge of second-degree murder, along with additional convictions related to the handling of Laura's remains. She received a sentence of 13 to 16 years in North Carolina and was subsequently tried and convicted in Texas on additional charges related to the disposition of Laura's body in that state, receiving a maximum consecutive sentence of 20 years from a Texas judge who described her conduct as barbaric. Laura Jean Ackerson's sons, along with the daughter that Grant and Amanda had together, were placed in the custody of Grant Hayes's parents. The case left a deep mark on the communities connected to it, not only as a story about the catastrophic consequences of a custody dispute that descended into the unthinkable, but as a reminder that the people capable of causing irreparable harm are not always recognizable as such from the outside. Grant Hayes had performed competently enough at the role of normal person that the truth of what he had done required the full weight of a forensic investigation stretching across 2 states to bring into the light.